going to be talking about religion and Druid links to Christianity and the importance of the Druids in the founding of Christianity in Britain. The fact that it was only the Christians and the Druids who were persecuted by the Romans, everybody else seemed to get away with it. And the concept now is to really try and see where the links between the Druidic knowledge and works, how they tied in with what was going on at Kharsag. We located the restart of civilization, agriculture, to a small group of survivors from global catastrophe in the Rikaya Basin south, which is that red dot in the middle of our image. Now it's 25 miles west of Damascus and 8 miles north of Mount Hermon. We have interesting clues here because in the Arab literature it said that the Garden of Eden was 25 miles from Damascus, of course, which it is. The other interesting thing is that when Muhammad died, the first major centre for Islam was at Damascus, and they built the great mosque in Damascus on the site of the temple of Baal-Hadad, which was the old Canaanite god who became a sun god under the Romans. So the extraordinary links between Islam and Damascus and Kharsag within the records. Mount Hermon's called the Snowy Mountain, or Mountain of the Chief. In the Hebraic literature, the sons of God lived near Mount Hermon. So we have all kinds of links which help to confirm the story. The other clues are these. We have Baalbek a very short distance away. We also have Sidon and Tyre. You can see them here. There is Sidon and there is Tyre. Two of the oldest and greatest trading cities, said to be Phoenician, but of course they were very much older under the name of the people of the land of Canaan. And the land of Canaan in this area had much greater sophistication before even Mesopotamia and Egypt. Now, even in 3000 BC, timber was being exported from Tyre to build structures and buildings not only in Egypt but also in Mesopotamia. So the cedar forests, which cover this whole area, are a key part and a key link in our story. We also have the story of Osiris, who was chopped up into bits and how he was put in a box and floated to Tyre. And this is obviously a distortion of an ancient story, but it's the links between Egypt and Tyre and the whole world in these two famous ports. And certainly Alexander the Great was told that the oldest cities in the world were Tyre and Sidon. We've got the two big rivers here, which are the Orontes, which runs north. You can just see that running up here to Oms, and then to Kadesh, which is very important historically, and Ebla, and out to the sea. And we're going to visit Urugrit, or Ras Shamara, which is further up, where there was a kinship school. And down here we've got the Litani, which runs south, and then out to the sea and southern Lebanon. So that gives you the picture of where things started from, and you'll probably notice there are so many interesting names which all link with our history and past. So it doesn't take much to see, quite apart from the farming issues and the origin of all the crops in this area, that we've got so many of the important sites and so much respect is paid to this area within history, even, as I say, particularly within Islam. Although Islam became confused, in my opinion, because in 1400 they began to think that Mecca and Becca were particularly important and moved south. And there is a book called The Bible Comes from Arabia. And this is largely because of the migrations of people from this area right the way down the Rift Valley to Aden and into Ethiopia. And we find the same names running right the way through, but the source of the names comes from this particular area. And I believe that there's a misunderstanding, and that Adam building the first temple or the first structure was in fact Cain building the platform at Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley. And I believe there was a confusion about mixing Bekaa with Mecca. And there's a very good paper by an Islamic scholar which I believe and it will be on my website soon, which makes this explanation. But we have to remember that this whole period is 9,500 BC, running right the way through to the time of Christ, which is an enormous time span. And we have migrations of people away from this area and back to this area when the climate changed. So it's these extraordinary migrations of people right the way down into Africa. And we find in Johannesburg, we find the Lemba tribe calling themselves Jews, and genetically they're related to the Levi family. So that group of people who are predominantly black in Johannesburg, wonderful people, they have a right to say that we are related to the Levi family coming from this part of the world. So we find this extraordinary diffusion of peoples and knowledge from this particular area. And we'll be talking about the people who came into Britain, the Cimmerians, Kimmerians, Kimri, Omri, all these links. And we find that there were big migrations of what I call all groups from this area, moving across Europe by land and particularly by sea, because they were terrific sailors and mariners with ocean-going ships from the earliest days. And we find that the families in this particular area had relations all over the world. And we come to the story of Jesus, and we're looking at Jesus' family having very strong links over many hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, with the people who migrated to Britain. And remember Joseph of Arimathea, or Arimathea, which means actually crown prince, not a town. We will see from Lawrence Gardner's work the reasons why he was considered to be the same person as James the Just. He was Jesus' younger brother. And he remained crown prince because Jesus survived the crucifixion and was around, and he retained that particular title, which is a title given to the second son. And remember, Jesus was on the line of David, and Joseph was a metal worker, a master craftsman, a tecton, and we have all the traditions within the family linking to Britain and the British royal family, and the trade in metals from Britain to the Near East, which was going on probably from 3000 BC. So I've got this particular image in here because it's so interesting. Every little part of it tells a story, and you could probably write a book on most of the issues. The Sea of Galilee, down into Jericho, south, and Nazareth is there. And of course we're talking about the Nazarenes Church, Nazarene Christians, and we're looking at the strong probability in my mind, and many religious scholars would agree, that what Jesus was attempting to do was to try and restore the old order. But they failed to do that, but we still have obviously a valuable story from there. But you see all the references to Jesus being a king of the Jews, and all the references, God in the temple. These are all back to Mesopotamia, to the Golden Age. So I think it would be fair to say, in my opinion, that Jesus was attempting to restore good government above all else. Some of his disciples thought it was going to be violent and had their swords ready. Jesus tried to do it peacefully, but it wasn't going to work peacefully, and it didn't work, very sadly. And this was part of this long-running battle between the Roman Empire, which had taken over the concept of the privatization of land rather than the common ownership of land, which was a key part in this whole story. The Roman Empire started about 700 BC, breaking away from the Etruscans. In the same area that the Etruscans lived. The Etruscans were true to the old order. That was a refuge of the Golden Age. And of course the Etruscans would have been considered to be Druids. And the Romans came along and conquered and stole and took and killed and murdered and wiped out people on a grand scale in order to establish their empire. They did have good aspects which they'd inherited from the Etruscans and from the old world. But the idea that it's what the Romans did for us, it's much more, I'm afraid, what they did for us, it was what they did to us. And so that's going to be part of this little story. These primary references for anybody, because when one makes the kind of statements I'm making, it has to be backed up by evidence. And you know about the genius of the few. We talked a little bit about the path of light, and There was a third book here, which is the Reverend Morgan's book, which was written in 1860, dedicated to Bishop of St David's, Connop. Brilliant book, one of the most important reads that you can imagine, I believe, in terms of putting the past history straight. And he explains so much, including his descriptions of St Paul in Britain, and there are, again, so many references that St Paul did briefly come to Britain, and we're going to look at that on our journey. Lawrence Gardner's Magdalen Legacy, we talked a little bit about that yesterday, but that is, I believe, one of the definitive books on Christianity, and should be taken extremely seriously. I know him well. He's an extraordinary scholarly researcher who makes use of computers in an unimaginable way to give him access to everything that needs to be known to make a solid evidence-based case for the points he puts in his book. And also a new book by Philip Blair called God's Credentials, where the first chapter appears on the Golden Age Project website, which is terrific confirmation that Anne and monotheism was what was going on right from the start, from the founding of the Kharsag or Garden of Eden site. Lawrence Gardner has given me permission to publish, or not to put on the web and put on my talk, totally unplugged, work that's not published yet, a 28-page paper with detailed references on the church origins in Britain. I've used this quote again. This was Barbara Joy's quote at the beginning of her chapter in The Genius of the Few, which is called The Unity of Truth. And I made the point about whether Quran does mean the readings and recitations of Anne. It's spelt Q-U-A-R apostrophe Anne. And in one of the marvellous books I've read, which was the Quran, and an English translation of everything in the Quran, my judgment on that was that Allah and Anne are the same person in the readings and recitations of God. The God that was being referred to here was Anne. And remember, Muhammad's sister-in-law was a Hanif, and Abraham was a Hanif, and they were looking back to the Abrahamic faith, not wanting a new religion, but the catastrophes, the really big problems from cometary debris, dust storms, had totally destroyed the great Bronze Age civilizations, and with it had destroyed the whole social order and structure of the Golden Age. The first stage of the O'Brien research was to look, when Tim retired in 1970, and they started by looking at standing stones in East Anglia, and the first area they looked at was the Wandlebury Hatfield Forest, Loxodrome as it became. And then they wrote this marvellous book, which how I really came linked in many ways to this through Canon Blair, who was the marvellous vicar again at Truro Cathedral. His son, I shared his library and lived in his mother's old room after she died, and he had 20,000 books. And his father had actually bought this particular book because of his interest in Bodmin Moor. And Jim O'Brien and Joy came down to the Pythagorean Society in Sherborne School in 1984, and we've got that lecture on tape on the website. But that was Canon Blair made that big break, and that linked me to Nigel, allowed me to do 4 years of research in his library, and have him, as like an Oxford scholar as he was, providing me with the books I needed to do all the basic research that I carried out. So a whole line of extraordinary coincidences made it possible for me to stand here now. So that was the starting point, and what we're looking at here is the Cam Valley Loxodrome. This is the Loxodrome, which is a curve, which meant the people who built it had precise knowledge of mathematics, precise knowledge of the curvature of the Earth, the size of the Earth, and Loxodrome astronomy was extremely important in terms of being able to calculate complex observational astronomy calculations from that line, and that's how astronomy actually started much later, when people began to want to be or become astronomers in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and they had to relearn what our ancestors had learned, but had been lost. That's the actual line itself, 26 megalithic miles, or 26 equal spaced markers, mostly standing stones or mounds of some sort, with the associated henges and other structures on that line. That's the definition of a loxodrome, and it's a line on the Earth's surface making a constant angle with the meridian, and this allows the determination, time determination, and most of the positional observations made visually, both of fundamental importance to astronomers. What then followed was probably on and off over 7 years, we're going backwards and forwards to Bodmin Moor, to do the most detailed survey ever done, professional survey ever done, on any large area of Britain, to produce this extraordinary feature of the megalithic Odyssey, to show that this was none other than a very important observational astronomy complex. And there it is at Bodmin Moor. And remember, these granite-bearing areas of Dartmoor and Bodmin Moor are very important. They're high in gold content, particularly tin on Dartmoor, tin mines down in Cornwall. And we've got evidence of ships taking tin ingots from Bigbury Bay at 3000 BC. The established archaeologists did not want to accept the dating of what were clearly ship's timbers found underneath the tin ingots. They didn't want to accept that they were 3000 BC, but grudgingly accepted 1000 BC. So the objective with both Line A and Bodmin Moor was to provide proof of deliberate astronomical design in ancient structures. And this had been called for by the archaeological establishment, who had refused to accept the research conclusions of Sir Norman Lockyer, Alexander Thom, Gerald Hawkins, and others. Bodmin Moor is interesting because Cornwall equals Kernow equals rock piles equal land of the cairns. This is what the name of Cornwall really means. And we find something like over 90 massive stone cairns built in this way with smaller stones, which were constructed along the ridges at this extraordinary astronomical observatory. Some people say more stone was moved in building of that than the Great Pyramid. And I would suggest that we had generations of young men coming from all over the world at that time to learn observational astronomy at probably the primary observational astronomy university in Britain, and this was part of their 20 years of training under the Druidic system. Wouldn't have been possible to prove by probability analysis that this was deliberately designed without the computer. And so back in 74, in the 70s, Tim O'Brien had mastered the art of the computer and was able to write the software and was an expert in those skills because of his job as one of the world's leading exploration geologists. Nobody else would have done it. It was one of those interdisciplinary skills which was necessary to reach these conclusions. And as we talked about yesterday, the big issue is about wholeness. It's about multidisciplinary approach, looking at the big picture and finding people with the right knowledge and skills to be able to solve specific problems when we're analysing and looking at history. The conclusion was therefore that there were 28 primary detonations and therefore proof of astronomical design. And Tim had pointed out that the Druids who ran such universities and were described as missionaries from Sidon considered that the secular pursuit of scientific knowledge was of first importance. They were not religious. Their primary role was knowledge. Scientific knowledge was of first importance, and the secular pursuit of scientific knowledge. It's so important to get this message across that ancient peoples were not religious in the way we see religion today. It's part of our problem. Got this hang-up about religion or having to have a religion. And atheism is another religion which seems to be equally damaging to the concept of understanding things as being part of a fringe cult somewhere. To Arthur de Nan, we have the story of the people of the god Anne, and they arrive suddenly in Ireland, and there's a lovely quote which is translated as, "The men of science were gods and the laymen no gods." Druid history, serpent means wise man or woman. We touched on that yesterday. Is associated with these arrivals, providing an unbroken links to the two-eyed and one-eyed serpents in Egypt. I am the serpent, Kharsag, I am a serpent, I am a druid, was their statement. In an Irish manuscript it is written that all those who are adepts in the druidical and magical arts are the descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the god Anu. In Southern Ireland there is still a saying, wise as the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Isle of Man was named after Danann Manahan, who set up a mystery school on the island and was famous for his powers to transport huge blocks through the air. His ship had no sails or oars, but went wherever he wanted it to go. And it looks as though his ship may well have been a Rua, but we won't deal with that at this particular point in time. The serpent was subsequently the totem of the house of David, and which they precede the Persian Magi, Egyptian and Canaanite priests, as well as the Levitical, Brahmin and Essene traditions. Very important point too, that annual councils of kings and Druid advisors to kings took place over the millennia in the original homelands. In Sumeria in the earliest times, the kings all met in council at Surupa, and the king of kings, who was appointed during whenever there were problems or wars or difficulties, the king of kings was called Shishak. We also have Ozymandias as the Greek name for king of kings, and in Britain it was the Pendragon, in the Saxon world it was the Bradwald. And so the kings worked in council. It was rather like a very sophisticated UN, where the people who went to the meetings were actually qualified to do the job and were able to appoint a man who was going to solve a problem if it ever arose. So we had a great system, simple system, of the best men doing the job to sort out kings who were bent or doing things wrong, or problems which had to be sorted out, and that may well have been having to deal with the consequences of global catastrophe. This is a quote on the Druids, and the Druidical schools were being formed, which were to hold knowledge to be their hereditary right, as Julius Caesar, and such as could make discourses to their scholars concerning the stars and their motions, the magnitude of heaven and earth. These are quotes which come from Caesar, which confirm what I'm saying of what Christian Lebron found. Julius Caesar comments, they have adopted the Greek alphabet. I'll come to that later in another text, because the Greek alphabet was in fact the Phoenician alphabet, and the Phoenician alphabet was what was called the alphabet, and the alphabet was the speedy writing of Enoch, which went back thousands of years, and was the in-house writing and language of the administrators of the world for many thousands of years. They had, their belief was in the indestructibility of the human soul. They held various discussions and lectures on astronomy, the extent and geographical distribution of the globe, on the different branches of natural philosophy, and on many problems connected with religion. Interesting, many problems connected with religion. Ogham writing and links to Kharsag again. This is from the Lost Zodiac of the Druids by Gregory Coulter, which is, I believe, a must-read. And we're seeing Ogham being used here. It says Ogham was based on the Greek prototype. In my opinion, Ogham was based on the very early alphabet, which one reads all about in a book called The Phoenician Letters, which describes very clearly that in-house they used, amongst the kingship schools and the elite, they used the speedy writing, and they provided a picture language, picture and symbol for ordinary people. Hence we get the hieroglyphs and the early Sumerian pictorial text, the Chinese pictorial, the Easter Island pictorial, the Minoan pictorial, all would go back to one very simple pictorial language, sign associated with the sound. But in-house they kept the speedy writing. And we find, for example, most people in this room, when they read, will be looking at words in a pictorial way. They'll pick up the first letter, the last letter, and they'll make their mind up. They don't really read it. It's a pictorial operation. And so it's very important to realise that spatial memory was essential for hunter-gatherers, and that's the way that the rulers, if you like, communicated with ordinary people, the same way that we provide people with road signs if we're crossing Europe, which we all understand. Now, the key point here is this link between Ogma, and that we have so many references to Og and Magog and Ogma and Ogmash. And I showed you a picture of Shamash, which goes back to Ugmash, and then to one of the leading seven rishis, or seven sages, or seven two-eyed serpent, we find Uta, who is a key figure. There was a calculation which I need supporting evidence on from anybody who can find it, but there is a precise astronomical date of this, what is said to be the start of the Druids. I believe it's the arrival of the Druids in Britain, because it ties in with so many other pieces of hard evidence of bright, clever people coming into Britain, bringing farming with them, bringing superior tools, having long heads rather than round heads. We seem to have a migration of people into Britain at this particular time, and there would have been very good reasons for it. And they're described as missionaries from Sidon, which is where you'd expect them to come from, the Eastern Mediterranean. What their system was based on was exactly the same as the Golden Age. The king's primary role was to deliver to the people freedom, justice, leisure and instruction. Neither God nor king or the people were above the law. I think that these were the edicts of Anu and Enil, and I explained that yesterday at the top of the Hammurabi Code stele in the Louvre. It actually says these are the edicts of Anu and Enil. And Anu and Enil also appear in Enuma, Anu and Enil, which was the Sumerian Encyclopedia of Astronomy. The Indo-European languages, I've translated it here as Druid and translating it as strong knowledge. It means strong, bright, clever, intelligent people. And we say we find distinctly long-headed people constructing the earliest long barrows and observatories around this time in the British Isles, with a wide introduction of mixed farming methods. In the Somerset levels, we've got, at this specific date now, comprehensive and complex timber trackways were built across between the islands of the Somerset levels. Superior access of green jadeite and other quality materials were introduced along with a range of improved skills. We're going to look and see what's special about Somerset a bit later on, because Summer, Summerland, some people thought it was the place where they grazed cattle in the summer lands, but it looks to me, and others too, as though there's a very strong link between Summer and Summer, and Somerset and Somerton, and Glastonbury, and what was going on. And we're going to see some of these extraordinary clues later on. Ballasnap Observatory on the Cotswolds, this very early date, long-headed people buried nearby, observing in just a few degrees off north towards the Leonids, where the meteor showers come from. And we have this cycle. They were worried about the sky falling. My opinion is that this was an observatory. They got in at this end here to observe. That is just where the Leonids come from. These were simply places to keep out of the bad weather. So most of the wind is blowing from west. So there's two holes here, and one in case the wind was blowing from the east. And here, when people from the village or whatever wanted to come up and have a good look at what's going on, they had a degree of shelter here looking north. And so this wasn't, in my view, a chamber tomb at all. It was superb stonework, and the finest stone waller in Gloucestershire, who's referred to in H.J. Massingham's wonderful book about the Cotswolds, said he would rather spend his holidays up here looking at the skills of the corbelling and the stonework at Ballasnap than going anywhere else in the country. How was it that they reached perfection in that art, and that we've never improved upon it since? Here we have the long-headed and round-headed people, and we find this trait even today in certain areas of Britain. It's very strong genes or resemblance, rather like dark hair, red hair. We find this distinction between round-heads and long-headed people. It doesn't mean that if you're a round-head you're any less clever than a long-headed person, but it's a distinct characteristic which was at one point in time followed very, very closely by our archaeologists, because they felt that that people were either primitive or they were clever like us. In reality, they hadn't really got a clue about what they were talking about. The basic doctrine of Druids, apart from all their other skills, which covered everything in my opinion, was that without freedom of will, there is no humanity. Freedom of conscience was both the birth and breath of manhood. The essence of the soul was will. And we're going to return to this concept that to every human being, their free will is their most important attribute. And when their free will is removed or eroded in any form, it creates big problems for everybody. And so the essential Druidic message. And the reason why I would persuade you all to be Druids rather than anything else is that you can help those people who are Druids now to look deeply into their past and begin to realise what was so important about the Druids and different about the Druids. And the two areas were this crucial aspect of freedom of will. Without freedom of will, you cannot have humanity, which needs really thinking about in an inhumane world. And the belief in the transmigration of the soul also seems to be very important from the kind of science we're now seeing and beginning to understand, and finding that all the ancients believed in that. We perhaps don't know scientifically whether they're right or wrong, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and see whether science can eventually prove them right. Because certainly their knowledge in the past in so many areas was so much superior to ours. The early classical writers, Pomponius Mela called the Druids masters of wisdom. There is a big point here by Diodorus Siculus about having to have somebody, a philosopher, who would be there for thank offerings and to be there to supervise the performing of a sacrifice. The whole issue of sacrifice has got completely distorted, in my view. Being a practical country person and a farmer, we should be paying the utmost respect to our animals when we say to them, goodbye, we're going to eat you now. And an enormous trouble was taken to do that in a respectful way. And the last thing that anybody wanted was any stress hormones in the meat. And at Baalbek there's even text saying that if any animal is not willingly coming onto the area where they're slaughtered, if they're not willing and relaxed, then they go away until they can come in willing and relaxed. And religious slaughter is, we know about it because we all bitch about it in terms of Islam and kosher, but in reality it's as important a part of our lives that we slaughter our animals and put our animals out of their misery in the most humane way, should they, as in many cases they will anyway, be sick, old, suffering, going back. So when we're culling deer, for example, we're wanting to take out the animals which are weak, which are sick, which are going to suffer if they stay alive. And this was the same with people. There was less worry about death because they believed in the transmigration of the soul. And people who were incurably ill were dispatched in this way, in a ceremony, rather like a funeral. But it was the way in which their world operated and the way they thought. And it's time we began to think realistically about this real world and what we would do if we had to deal with elderly relatives in an Eskimo setting or an African setting or wherever it might be, and how we would deal with our own animals from which we derive so many important products for our survival. And this is about how reliable were the classical writers. Well, you all know about what people say about the Druids, painted savages. There's so many views, and much of the unpleasant material comes from Roman historians. And what is interesting, and this is Miranda J. Green's book, what is interesting is that Christian writers were sympathetic to the pagan Druids. There was no difficulty between Christians, early Christians and Druids. And this is a very important point from Professor Jean Markel. The Romans based their law on private ownership of land, with the property rights entirely vested in the head of the family, whereas the Druids always considered ownership collective, common ownership of land. Very important point. We see this in the whole concept of people, for example, coming into Britain would have been given either 3 or 5 acres of land, depending on the quality of the land, and free passage through the country. That was granted to everybody who came to Britain, immigrated into this country, so they could feed themselves and their families. And the concept of tenant right is that land, paying value, paying for land, should be a price you pay for the work that had been done to that land to make it productive. Another crucial point in understanding land management and land tenure. And if you steal land away from people and don't pay them tenant right for the work they put into that land, that was considered to be the worst possible crime to humanity. And yet that's exactly what we've seen in Zimbabwe, with the most devastating consequences. Their motto was the truth against the world. And Morgan says that, the Reverend Morgan, who I referred to earlier, says that Christianity was a new thing in Asia, but there was never a time when the Druids of Britain held not his doctrines. Druidism presented a high culture and a priesthood of peace. In parallel, Buddhism was a Druidic religion. By controlling the vast mineral wealth and other resources of Britain for the people of Britain, the Druids were presented a serious rival to Greece and Rome. And of course, under Augustus and Tiberius, it was a treasonable offence to be a Druid. This is what Rome did to us. Now let's look at some of the sophisticated skills. This is the Royal School at Eurogrit, certainly before 1400 BC, I think more likely 1800 BC. The acceptance is that those Phoenician letters go back to 1800 BC, but these were in cuneiform tablets at the Royal School of Eurogrit at Ras Shamara. And this is one of a series of 10 letters, for one having responsibility at the Sar-Man Brotherhood of the Prince of the Land of the Four Directions at the Royal School of Eurogrit, being an aspirant to the Brotherhood. This is typical Druid material. And this relates to a letter from the tutor to the pupil. And what is being explained here is a black hole. And we are told that the stars without number that we see in the heaven, each one the progeny, the inhabitants of heaven, will in their turn populate the heavens to time without end. So the story goes that when a sun or star dies, it goes forth in a piercing flash of light after compressing upon itself until it can press no more, and flies apart in a myriad of particles, each particle finding itself a space wherein it can gather from the heavenly soil nourishment for its growth, and in due course make itself a world, as our Lord Shamash has done. And this is a must-read, again, the Phoenician letters by Wilfred Davis and somebody called Zur. And this same page, as this is mentioned, is a compost heap, and exactly how to build and make a compost heap and how you recycle your garden waste and your voidings. And what is being said here is this is how a black hole works. It recycles material in space. And I sent this letter to a Telegraph and Times who wouldn't publish it, but it was published in the Daily Mail. And I sent a copy to Stephen Hawking at Cambridge, who had just recently said, I was wrong about black holes, they do recycle things. That knowledge is being taught to sons of kings in 1800 BC and before. That is the level of sophistication we're talking about, and that is proof of it. People doing extraordinary things at 7,500 BC at that site. But this is a later version of polished obsidian. And we still don't know how the obsidian was polished to that kind of quality. And that is the kind of artifact that we see here in the 19th and 18th century BC, and made in Egypt and present to somebody in the land of Canaan, as I shall prefer to call it rather than Phoenicia. This is another must-read latest book in understanding what the Dogon were doing, and the Dogon understood the atom. They understood neutrons and electrons and protons. The germination of a sene was about 4 types of quantum spin particles. The spider of the sene, whose threads weave 266 seeds of Amma, much as string theory tells us all matter is woven from strings. Basic creative impulse of the gods, from whom all these particles emerged, which is stated in terms that run parallel to the concept of the 4 basic quantum forces. So today, in Africa, the oral evidence which the Druids would be passing down is still being passed down by survivors of that great culture, using the Egyptian hieroglyphs to explain these scientific principles. It's one of the best pieces of evidence we have that we have lost the plot completely in our modern age. Bushborough lozenge. This was a 9-fold geometry which produces acute angles which define the range of sunrises at the latitude of Stonehenge. Now it's specifically for the latitude of Stonehenge, and the Clarendon gold plate on the right was at a more southerly location where the angles were different. And it looks from the differences there that may well have been originally from northern France, but that was found at Dorchester, and the Bushborough lozenge was found near Stonehenge. And that's what was lying across the chest of a tall man, measuring 7 inches. Fantastic craftsmanship. Absolutely wrecked during restoration and is in the Devizes Museum. And some people have actually said it should be one of our most prized artifacts from archaeology in this country, but most people haven't heard of it. Polished copper mirror. copper was polished to make mirrors in Egypt, and this is a model, probably a craftsman's model. It may well have been a mirror on the top of a chest in somebody's house. It was found and deposited in a peat bog, presumably because they didn't want it stolen or taken away by somebody else. It's a concave bronze disc, which when polished would have made, because it was concave, would have made an excellent telescope. Gold leaf all round on the outside. And a marvellous American man called Larry Radke has demonstrated that they were able to polish bronze and get a mirror finish, fantastic mirror finish, which would have been used as the same kind of telescope that Hubble was, one big giant concave disc. And Larry Radke's view is that the Pharos lighthouse worked on the principle of one of these very large concave bronze discs with batteries and electrodes, and you provide a spark between the electrodes, produce extraordinarily high quality lamp, which is exactly what we were doing with searchlights and spotlights in the 1880s and 60s and 90s. And that technology, he believes, is all the evidence is there that they understood these kind of technologies at that time. And of course that was called an arc light. The Gunstrup cauldron, and we've got Cernus with the antlers in the meditation pose which we find in India. And another most wonderful artifact. The Coligny calendar, another extraordinary object which is measuring very accurately the year, and shows that the Druids were certainly as sophisticated as anybody else on the planet in terms of their skill in observation and astronomy and understanding the sky. That is a little example of the workmanship in the 3rd century BC, which is beautiful, as you can see there. These weren't painted savages, were they? This is something which will interest you because not much has been talked about the geometric altars, but a researcher called S.C. Cack showed that the very earliest Brahmin astronomers, rather like the Druid astronomers, they produced these extraordinary, and this goes back to the 3rd millennium BC, they were able to build Vedic fire altars, they called them, and temples, but in fact they were very sophisticated computers built up in 5 layers of thousands of bricks of specified shapes. The whole formed a sophisticated astronomical calculator, which enabled them to calculate the length of the tropical year precisely, and a 95-year cycle, the precession of the equinoxes, and the value of a lunar year divided into 360 parts called a tethi, 360-degree geometry, 3000 BC, and knowledge of the 25,920-year cycle of precession. And that's what it looked like. So when we look at technology and look deep enough and hard enough, we find the most amazingly sophisticated technology right the way across the Indo-European world at these early times. And they could only have come from the much earlier, sophisticated, archaic world when the Golden Age existed. Megalithic structures, this is the distribution of megalithic structures, and they tie in with where early people were concentrated and living in the temperate zones where farming was favourable, life was favourable, after perhaps the pressures in this area here had really built up, and people had to migrate from the Samaria because the monsoons moved south, the land became so dry that salination was a problem and they had to switch from wheat to barleys. But we find megalithic structures all around the world. Madagascar, just a little example, coincides nearly always with mineral or metal deposits, and this coincides with the only place where we find the ring-tailed lemur. And we find the ring-tailed lemur tattooed on people going down the Silk Road here at this date of 2700, when people were moving from Sumeria down the Silk Road into northern India and into China, with Nung Ti being a Sumerian man who was called by the Chinese Hung Ti, first emperor, and Shen Nung was the same person as Sargon the first. And the dates have to be revised because it seems clear that the dates are wrong for Sargon the first, who was about 2700 BC. But I won't divert too much on that, but I want to give you the message of the migrations of people to Europe from that centre here, which started in the land of Canaan. Fastall's Lodge, why were they building these structures? This is the Long Barrow. That's how it was built. My view is that they were built in stages as the population grew, and that they were really principally Anderson shelters to hide from the sky falling. They were later used to store bones. People were exhumed, and the bones were stored in family compartments, I'm sure, after the big risk of cometary debris had passed. They didn't do anything without working out very carefully that they'd have multi-purpose uses. Many of the long barrows are very sophisticated, and I'll show you in a minute, and clearly were accommodation, maybe even pubs or stopping off places in the very early times for people travelling around. And they served the dual purpose of being strong enough to protect people from the sky falling, and then providing all the other needs and purposes, like taking your animals and yourselves and your families in during these difficult times. And the bones were piled up inside, and later on, of course, we had bonfires or bonfires, and that's the origin of the word bonfire, from the bones which were built up over time in some of these places. West Kennet, extraordinarily sophisticated, enormous trouble taking organic, inorganic material layered in the roof in order to be able to be protected from cosmic radiation, a big dose of any form of radiation in the forms that it could have arrived, the sky falling. All these factors were considered in these structures. And this is the passage, we call it the passage grave, but you can see the reconstruction of this passage grave with the Corbel passage in France. And when you go to France and the Mediterranean further south, you find far more sophisticated versions of the same thing, which is a clue to what we're looking at. And this is from a book called Dolmens of the Dead. This is Stonehenge, which you all know about, but not many people realise that you've got all the carpentry joints round the top of Stonehenge, and the only reason you're going to all the trouble in fitting those stones in that way was to support a massive roof. And my principal view, and many other key people who have written books on the subject, will tell you they wouldn't have gone to all that trouble putting up that structure without having a roof on it. They could have done all their astronomical calculations without the roof, and if you remember, many of the stones on the outside of Stonehenge were used, station stones, the Aubrey holes were all the key parts of calculating the length of the year, and crucial in terms of understanding whether the Earth had moved on its axis, etc., etc. And we find the first astronomical structure at Stonehenge, certainly 7,500, 8,000 BC. Durrington walls, well, this is an image I've got of how these roofs would have looked. They would have been very similar to the kind of big communal houses you see still just in the Amazon. Same principles, same complex. And what I believe also was happening was they were storing winter fodder in these type of wood-hinged buildings, where they would have put a roof on, there may even been something resembling canvas skins to make sure that winter fodder was kept dry, because winter fodder was crucial in overwintering their breeding stock and maybe the animals they were going to eat over the winter months. The rest of the world before 2000 BC, this is Gozo, Malta, wonderful caves, and this is overlooking the most fertile plain. People forget that parts of Malta would have been wonderful farming areas for the first farmers to arrive there. And this is the journey. We find agriculture starting where I've mentioned. This is the official view, that agriculture started here, the earliest dates for any agriculture in the world, although we're talking about a restart of civilization, and therefore there were clearly field systems and farms and seeds going back 50 or 60,000 years. It would be very difficult to find the evidence, although some people have found evidence and of course been not taken seriously. But these are the dates. So people were getting to Malta, the farmers were getting to Malta 5000 BC, and then coming round by sea, which was much the easiest way to travel and much the easiest way to take the minerals back to the Mediterranean. And if you look at all our main mining operations, they're very close to where ships could be loaded. And you load a big ship, and you take, within 3 or 4 weeks, you've delivered it to your merchant, if you like, back here in Palestine, where they were mining copper at 5,500 BC. And so this is the route for most of people and agriculture. And we'll be looking at this route again with St. Paul travelling from Caesarea to Rome, and then finding that they didn't go through the Messina Straits here because it was too dangerous if the weather was bad. They would go round Sicily to Rome, and we find St. Paul being shipwrecked on Malta and then disappearing off the map for about a year and a half, and that's where we believe he could have and would have probably, if he had any brains, jumped on the next boat going to Britain, and that would have taken him to Britain and Spain, because we know he taught in Spain and then arrived in Britain. But that's a bit of a diversion, what we're going to talk about later. This is the marvellous structures in Malta, and you'll see the similarities between these massive structures and Skara Brae and the ones in Spain, which give us the clues that people wanted their principal buildings, their administrative buildings, to be immensely strong so that they would be protected from the sky falling and that they could continue whatever the world threw at them. That is, you can see the actual structure, the city-state system still, the community buildings here, they all had community buildings and centres, always close to where the agriculture was, and that's a perfect representation of agriculture, being close to where the great tamons, as they were called, En or On, whichever way you look at it, and that's where the word temple evolves from. Temple evolves from an administrative building. And mosques, remember, are almost totally administrative buildings with hospitals, schools, just about every facility and service, and they more closely resemble what was originally in place in the Golden Age than our churches do. This is an illustration showing slab roofing, but people wanted to know how they were roofed, and we've seen from the earlier dolmens that they knew about corbelling, and it's clear that we have a situation here where this is a model showing how those roofs were made, which was corbelling of these massive blocks, which would have made it, you can see, immensely strong. They were building caves. The people who survived in the early times lived in caves, so let's build a cave and then we've got a chance of surviving. This was the way in which people thought in those times, this is my view. And then they covered them with earth to make sure they were really waterproof. And we see this, remember, at Newgrange and Knoll and many other places, and our dolmens and our long barrows are always covered in a thick layer of earth, and they had a mixture of organic and inorganic material. The hypogeum was hollowed out of the rock, so they're able to make a whole series of buildings underground. We find this in Cappadocia, and we find that design of roof, which was to try and create a lovely building underground, they showed there that what was happening, they knew about corbelling at that time, and their knowledge may well have gone back several thousand years earlier on that. And remember, these structures are 1,000 years before the pyramids. That is Hakar Kim, and you've got the northern maximum position of moonset, you've got the sunset midsummer, and all the buildings on Malta were aligned in this way. And remember, the Victorian architects still put up their houses to the basic alignments. And I remember living in a house built by Ernest Jimson, the arts and crafts movement, which was my home for 12 years in Gloucestershire. And I remember looking out of my window directly square on the setting sun, midsummer, and it was absolutely square to the house. They were doing it then. And here you've got the sunsets opposite a small rectangular doorway. And so they had these holes and doorways, small ones, so that they could still do their observational astronomy even when things were getting tough outside. And that is an image of all the Malta structures and the alignments and the fact that they got that all planned in. And Skara Brae, very, very similar. That's a wonderful structure. That was for craftsmen. There were workshops, there were houses, there was a big bed by the door, so that when if you were woken up in the night, you got your sword hand here and you could stop somebody coming in. And of course they had flush loos and little areas where they could keep seafood fresh. Great sophistication. And terrific protection from what the sky was going to throw at them. This has just been discovered at La Mancha in Spain, which is an extraordinary structure, which is a cross between what we've been looking at and the Scottish Broch. That is a plan of it. And they're very similar in many ways to the Scottish Broch, which came later, and the kind of structure we see in Malta, but all with the same purpose, compartments. Areas where grain was stored, where livestock were. It was to bring all their farming animals and storehouse in, so that if things got difficult, they probably could live for 6 months or longer, and they probably had water wells in these places too, and they were like survival capsules from bad times. Where would Jesus have been educated? Now that's the big question we come to now, because we know the story of Jesus. There has been a book written called Jesus the Druid, and we've got to think what was going on at the birth of Jesus around the rest of the world. And we find that Pythagoras was supposed to be a Druid. We find that the Greeks were being taught by Druids from Britain. They believed in the transmigration of the soul. All the basic principles of Druidism existed all around the Mediterranean out to India at that time, and in particular at Alexandria. And we have a Jew called Philo at Alexandria, who, if Jesus had gone to Alexandria, he would have almost certainly met Philo and been taught by Philo probably. And so we look around seriously to see where Jesus might have got his education. We've got several interesting places to go to. And the story in those times was that if a young man wanted to really be educated, he finished his education in Britain, because the high culture, the Druidic high culture, still survived in Britain. It had survived from that Roman onslaught, if you like, which started from the Roman Empire being created at about 700 BC. And so it was only when Caractacus was captured or handed in. They never ever defeated Caractacus' brother Arviragus in the West Country. There were peace treaties, there were giving marriages between key people in the different royal families, and there had been a two-way flow of people from Rome to Britain from the earliest times, and family links. So many of the Britons who went to Rome felt quite at home because their relatives were there, in the same way that people coming from Palestine to Britain were quite at home because their family links were there. So let's have a look and see. One of the things that's, again, being on the right path and being able to look seriously at Jesus is Christian O'Brien's translation of the Askew and Bruce Codices, which are the only or principal source documents we have of what Jesus was actually teaching to his inner circle of disciples. And it was witnessed by Matthew, Philip and Thomas, recorded by them, witnessed by them, which was the way in which Hebraic documents, official documents, had to be witnessed. So we can say to every churchman, and I wish there were some here, this is a document witnessed by three of the most important of Jesus' disciples, in the same way that the Hebraic legal document was witnessed. And Christian O'Brien has translated it. It was in Coptic. It was survived at Thebes and was found by Bruce, the Bruce Codex, and a bookseller called Askew. They're part of the same document, and Christian O'Brien rearranged them. They're more commonly known, parts of it, as the Pistis Sophia. And here we have Jesus teaching his inner circle of disciples, which includes both men and women, with Mary Magdalene and Jesus' mother playing full roles in the discussions. So much so that the disciples are jealous, or appear to be jealous, of Mary Magdalene taking all the action, because she asked about 38 of 41 questions, I think. And of course, the church was so quick to dismiss it as saying it was totally evil. What utter nonsense that Mary Magdalene could possibly be asking all these questions. But there's the document, the book's to be read, people can draw their own conclusions. And it would have been apprised, very important, these texts were used by Valentinus in about 120 AD, and he almost became a pope. Only just pipped at the post for some reason, possibly because he was too extreme, because he was teaching transmigration of the soul and journeys of the soul as Jesus was. And these records would have been in the Alexandria Library, the great library. And this is part of Lawrence Gardner's latest research, that the Arian Christians, remember, they were Christians. Britain was Arian Christians. They didn't believe in all the magic of a virgin birth and the resurrection from the dead. Those all came in much later. And so the Arian Christians were no different really from the Druids. And it's a key point. But they were hounded out of existence, hung up and persecuted by the Church of Rome, who wanted to stamp their authority on everything from the time that Constantine gave them all the powers and land to do their job. But Constantine was blessed by an Arian bishop on his death. That was the conversion. He was converted, if you like, by an Arian bishop, not a Church of Rome bishop. And it's very important to distinguish this point. And the whole story of St. George was invented by the Catholic Church later, not long afterwards, but 100 years later, that George was a comrade of Constantine the Great, when in fact he was a great friend of Constantine's son, who was Emperor Constantinus. And George of Lydia, IA, was the Arian Bishop of Alexandria, which was more important than Rome at that time. He was beheaded by a mob during a very difficult time in AD 361 and cut up and left on the beach. And they wanted to cut him up in little bits so nobody could bury him or pay their respects to him later. And under the persecution, this was under the persecution of the Catholics and Arians under Emperor Julian the Apostate, who went back on the other emperor, on the Edict of Milan and what had been agreed before, which was for tolerance to religion. And of course, the story is horrific, because in AD 391, Emperor Theodosius instructed George's successor, Catholic Bishop Theophitus, to fire and destroy the Serapeum Library. So all those records were lost. There was a war going on between the Church of Rome and the Arian Christians. And the Arian Christians were winning it. So the Rome had to get dirty and use the emperor and the army to suppress that knowledge. And we find this tradition right around the Mediterranean. And George was a great hero amongst the Arian Christians because he was their leader. He was made Bishop of Alexandria, given the top job by Arius himself. And so he was such a popular figure, and still is, that he had to be turned into a Christian hero who killed the dragon, rather than the man he was, who was the opponent of everything the Church of Rome was doing. Within the Path of Light, there's two very important paragraphs. And this is Jesus speaking in the Bruce Codex. It is necessary that they should find the initiation which is in the books of Jude, and which I caused Enoch to write in the Garden of Eden when I spoke to him in the building of knowledge and the building of life. Jesus had claimed to be at the Garden of Eden 9,000 years before. Now, that was a reincarnation, or he made it up. We have to try and work out how that particular point arose. But we have Muhammad using exactly the same Enoch story, going to heaven, and following exactly the same threads that Enoch gave. So both Jesus and Muhammad were making the same claims. Now, whether they're right or wrong, I won't make the judgment on that, but I want to just bring everybody's attention to that, because my belief is that Islam and Druidism were one and the same originally. And remember, Islam went down the route of education, education, education. Rome was supposed to go down the same route. That was what Constantine required them to do, to set up universities and colleges, as been done amongst the Druids. But the Church of Rome didn't do that. That was the difference. And that's why I believe that Islam went off at a tangent, because it was in direct opposition to what the Church of Rome was doing. And what the Church of Rome was doing was totally wrong. That's my judgment on the situation. In this book, extraordinary book and the translation, Christian O'Brien, because he looks at it from a secular point of view and understood the Eastern religions, he makes a clear point that what Jesus is doing is providing scriptural evidence that Jesus taught Shura Shabbat Yoga and should be recognized as a perfect living master. And Shura means soul, Shabbat means word, and Yoga means union. And this ties in with the word we were talking about yesterday on sound and meditation, and in Joy's chapter, which is on the website, called the Unity of Truth, we find Osiris in the yoga position, and we can see that this type of meditation or spiritual understanding or out of body or whatever is happening here is something that goes back to the earliest times. And somebody asked me a question about spirituality. That's the only spirituality or anything that resembles religion that we can find back in those ancient times. Religion, as we know it, is a new concept which seems to have distorted and destroyed so many people's lives. Shurat means soul, Shabbat means word, and yoga means union. That's the best description I've got, unless anybody can improve upon it. The search for British Druidic colleges and academies. the people who came to Britain, you'll see this wonderful map about the time of Jesus, and this land of the Cymry, which all the way up to Yorkshire here, from South Wales. And we have the Cimmerians, the racial name for the Celts, the Cymry, remains of the Welsh Cymry, originating from King Omri, founder of Samaria. And the best view I have, that this area was devastated by by a cometary debris event around about 800, which coincided with the time that the Assyrians took over and finished the concept of King Omri's kingdom in Samaria. And I believe that many of those people migrated and occupied that vacant land at that time. This is where we get the Welsh language from. And I've made the parallels in other talks about the similarity between the Hindu way of speaking, the Welsh way of speaking, and also the Hebrew way of speaking, because those languages are always very closely linked. And if you listen to a Welshman, listen to an Indian, and my life, you've got extraordinary similarity in the sounds that all those people make. And this shows this extraordinary link we have. And this is where we find, of course, if it had been Samaria, then I believe that these people would have not been far distant relatives from Jesus and his family, going back many generations. In fact, we all go back, in population dynamics, we all go back to those single Y chromosome of 50,000 BC. So the Celts, inhabitants of England and Wales, the Kelts, inhabitants of Hibernia, Ireland, Gaels, the inhabitants of Scotland, Gaelic, the people of Gaul, now France. Ethnically, they're all the same people. The meaning of the word in each case is stranger, indicating that the Celt, Gael and Gaul were strangers in the land in which they dwelt, not an aborigine as some would have us suppose. There clearly are, genetically we know that there are a remnant group, which we call Picts and Cornwall on the west coast, which link with the Basque and the Berber and the earlier times, but the large proportion of immigrants came from the Mediterranean. And that's what the genetic evidence shows, although some of them may well have been come from Spain, stopped off on Spain on their way and moved north from Spain to Britain. Copper mines, that was a big attraction. This is the Great Orme mine near Bangor in Wales. And the word Bancorum or Bangor, to some language experts, does mean college or corps or academy. And I'm going to suggest that we've got a Druidic academy, Bangor-on-Dee. This is just a little example of long barrows in Derbyshire where the lead outcrop is. We've got henges, all those henges. We've got lung barrows. They're going to be very early dates. They must be, I would have thought, 3,500 or earlier. And what people were doing was mining the lead. Why? Because it contained up to 17% silver. And it was very easy. It was on the surface. Very easy. And the ship, and you see these rivers here, they would have taken that lead very quickly down these rivers to the sea. This is the meeting place of the Druids at Nant Gwynant Valley and Dennis Emrys. There's a lead mine very close to here, and it's interesting to see Druid centres so close to these mineral resources, linking the Druids with the mineral resources. Down just the other side from Snowdon, we're going to see the sacred river to the Druids called the Dee, and this is the Dee, and it runs down to Bangor-on-Dee. And I'm suggesting, I can't prove it, but all the evidence points to it, that this was already established as a major educational establishment at the time of Jesus and at the time that St. Paul decided to visit it. And we're going to follow the history of Bangor-on-Dee because it tells us the history of British Christianity better than anything else. There it is today. You can see the original round structure here in the banks on the river, and it always has had a pretty good banked area around it. And when it was neglected, the whole of this flooded, and the worst floods we've had for a long, long while. But there is a tradition and evidence of a great university here. That is the kind of structure that's typical of the early educational establishments and settlements. And we've got the story of St. Paul leaving Caesarea to go to Rome, which I touched on, coming to Malta, being shipwrecked. The suggestion is, because it's the only gap we can find, of about a year where he disappears from view and then ends up and finds himself back to Rome, but he I believe, took a ship this way, preached in Spain, and went to Britain. And he apparently arrived down on the south coast of Britain, which makes sense. But he headed straight for Bangor-on-Dee, and Bangor-on-Dee has all his traditions within their texts, and there are pages of references to this, and he had his motto on the 4 gates of the university. And this was the main justification here was by Theodotus in 435, but there's the rule of Paul. It was always termed the mother of all monasteries by St. Hilary and St. Benedict. And even Bede, another authors state that the number of monks in it were 2,100, and scholars amounting to many thousands, by contrast to what may be right or wrong, the first Egyptian monastery was said to be founded by Pachomius in 360 AD. These are all references from various sources, very important sources, including the Vatican Museum and Merton College, Oxford, which confirm St. Paul visiting Britain. And the Pelagian heresy comes next. We find that Pelagius, in fact, is the abbot, 20th abbot of Bangor-on-Dee, 400 years later, and is described as being in truth nothing else than a revival of Druidism and the old Druidic ideas with regard to the nature and free will of man. He resigned from Bangor and was sent by a synod at Winchester and went abroad to take on these issues direct with the church authorities in Rome. And one of his quotes is that only in Britain is the British church judged. He wasn't going to take nonsense from Rome, although he was a very wise and probably extremely peaceful man. The concept of his view of life about free will being more important than original sin is that Adam would have died even if he had not sinned, that the sin of Adam injured himself alone and not the human race, that newborn children are in the same condition in which Adam was before the fall, that the whole human race does not die because of Adam's death of sin, nor will the race rise again because of the resurrection of Christ, that the law, back to the law again, gives entrance to heaven as well as the gospel, that even before the coming of Christ there were men who were entirely without sin. And this is because Augustine of Hippo wanted to impose this concept of original sin and divine grace, which is, in fact, I almost use the word mumbo-jumbo, but what I'm trying to say, it was a Catholic constriction placed on people so the church could control them. I want just to read these wonderful statements here, because this particular short section sums up in my mind all we're talking about and shows what went wrong. This is the statement made in 607, a protest by the British Church in refusing to accept St. Augustine. It was signed on behalf of the Archbishop of St. David, 6 bishops, and the Bishop of Bangor-on-Dee, who conducted the conference with Augustine. So even at that late date, it's very, very important. We have nothing to do with Rome. We know nothing of the Bishop of Rome and his new character of the Pope. We are the British Church, the Archbishop of which is accountable to God alone, having no superior on earth. And this is Francis Bacon, one of the great historians of all time. The Britons told Augustine that they would not be subject to him, nor let him pervert the ancient laws of their church. These are comments about Bede, and even Bede making the point that there was a big monastery. And this is 1,200 monks eventually perished at the Battle of Chester in AD 16, effectively because the British Church would not bow down to the Pope. The Northumberland Saxons under Athelfrith had a battle, which is the Battle of Chester. The monks all turned out to fight on behalf of the people, and they were slaughtered. And the big argument is whether it was 1200 or 1800, but it doesn't really matter. It was just the greatest or the worst violation of British history and British people ever, and the more people know about it, the better. And of course, William of Malmesbury, who was very keen to put the record straight and was a brilliant man, and he was totally redeemed by Baronius, the Vatican's own historian, and Polydor Virgilius. And here, somebody, a modern historian, is saying that they were Williams of Malmesbury's figures on the Bangor University were gross inventions, and that there were probably only 12 or 13 people there, because those kind of places didn't exist at that time. This is what modern historians have said. So this is our most precious history being absolutely wrecked. Morgan's conclusions are a must read for anybody. Lawrence Gardner, we've got Linnaeus being the first bishop of Rome, who was the son of Claudia, who was Practice's grandson. We have Baronius and the Vatican archive saying it's on record that Christianity had entered Britain as early as AD 35. Official from the Vatican. Edict of Milan. Simon Zelotes, and was the first of the apostles 2 years after the crucifixion, coming to Britain. Followed by Astrolobus, who was a bishop. Three British clerics took pride of place at the Council of Arles in 314, and then the letter from Augustine to Pope Gregory, which says, written in AD 600, In the western confines of Britain there is a certain royal island of large extent surrounded by water abounding in all the beauties of nature and necessities. In its first Nephites, God beforehand acquainted them, found a church constructed by new human art, but the hands of Christ himself for the salvation of his people. The church was dedicated by Jesus' son, not by Jesus himself, and he dedicated the church to his mother Mary Magdalene, who died in AD 64, the year of her dedication. You can read all about that within the Lawrence Gardner material. Wattle Church, there it is, that's the site of it. And we've got the 12 Hides, clearly located in Somerset, a marvellous book by Ray Gibbs. We've got this extraordinary, equidistant structure with Somerton straight in the middle, which is the capital of Somerset, with all these links back to Suma. And that is a line from Cadbury Castle. The arrow, you see the arrow, that points to the top of Glastonbury Tor. And they're precisely the same distances apart. Cadbury to Glastonbury Tor, to Boroughbridge Munt to Ham, laid on the ground. And one side of that extraordinary line is right up to Bury St Edmunds. So this line here runs Boroughbridge Munt, Glastonbury Tor, Avebury, and ends up here. And it's called the Michael line. But they were straight lines, as Michael Hodges says, and I believe they were there by the first ancient surveyors who surveyed the country very accurately because they wanted to allocate the land fairly. So everything had to be surveyed so that land allocation was fair for the people who came to Britain and were allocated land. And here is something I didn't believe in, I now do. Right at that Boroughbridge Mump on that line is the nose of the called the Girt Dog, which is at the entrance to the Glastonbury Zodiac. And it just speaks for itself, going and looking at the extraordinary features which can only have been deliberately laid out right from the very earliest times when the River Parrett was dug and the marshes drained. And remember, we've got ships coming right down to Bleedney, very close to the Mendips, to pick up the silver, the lead, all the metals that were mined on the Mendips, which Joseph of Arimathea would have been organising, and coming down the river here, the old River Brew, to Street Bridge. So Joseph would have got off the ship and climbed up Wherryall Hill to Glastonbury. That would have been his route anyway, arriving by ship. And ships would have been coming in here for thousands of years, or certainly in the 1,000 years prior to Glastonbury, being visited by Jesus' son. And we've got a very easy trip for Joseph of Arimathea to look at his mines and contacts on the Mendips, and then slip across the Bristol Channel to Llanillid, where Caractacus is buried, by Llantwit Major on the beach, or going up any of those Welsh rivers to visit the mines. And so he was very closely in touch. At this particular centre, Glastonbury, he was in the middle of the main mining operations in Wales, the Mendips, and not that far from Cornwall. And the ship would have been the way he went round, and his ships would have been big and brilliant and well organised and competent, as were the British ships at that time, because the British Navy supplied the Gauls in France with all their needs in fighting Rome. And that was one of the reasons that the Romans attacked the Venuti, who were the tribe on the west coast of Britain, who had massive sea-going ships, terrific sails, could withstand the Atlantic storms, and they were wiped out almost at a man because they were supplying the support for the Gauls who were trying to withstand the Roman invasions. And we have a massive Roman genocide of the Gauls in France. We've got the royal family here going back to Belly, and extraordinary links here because we can find back to Brutus. We've got Brutus coming in. We have Hugh Gardwan, who's a contemporary of Abraham, and even further back we have, I think, a grandson of Noah called Gomeride, and somebody said, well, that's where Montgomery is named after Gomeride. So we find people coming from the Near East into Britain, and all these bloodlines, if you like, going back to the land of the Bible, the land of Sumeria, from the earliest of times. Tremendous links. All makes sense, all begins to come true. And there, go and visit, if you're in Rome, the first church in Rome, where it's called Santa Pudentia. And this is Claudia. Pudentia was Claudia's daughter. Claudia was the daughter of Caractacus while they were in exile. And Claudia's daughter, Pudentia, married Rufus Pudens, a Roman nobleman, and they set up a church and a safe house for all the Christians in Rome. And even Saul, who became Paul, was based here, and is suggested that, in fact, Paul was a half-brother of Rufus Pudens. And there's quite a bit of evidence on that, but it's another interesting area to look at. So we've got several interesting things there. The possibility that Jesus spent part of his education being finished, if you like, in Britain, and that his mission to restore government and kingship in Palestine had a British base. Now, I can't prove that conclusively, but I think if we look hard enough, we'll be able to find that out. And Polydore Virgulo, commissioned by the Henry VII to write the history of Britain, he was the Pope's tax payer, and this is what he says, and we can't have anything better than this because it's confirmed by Baronius. Arviragus was the principal chief in Britain during the Principate of Nero. At this time, Joseph of Arimathea, who according to Matthew, the evangelist, gave burial to Christ's body, either by happenstance or in accordance with God's will, came to Britain with no small company of followers, where both he and his companions earnestly preached the gospel and the teaching of Christ. By this many men were converted to true piety, filled with the wholesome fruit, and were baptized. Those men were assured full of the Holy Spirit. They received the king's gift, a small plot of land about 4 miles from the town of Wells, where they laid the first foundations of a new religion, and where today there is a magnificent church and a Benedictine monastery. The name of the place is Glastonbury. The first beginnings of Christian piety existed in Britain. If they hadn't been trained in Druid qualifications, if they hadn't been on the same path as the Druids, would they have been given a hide of land each when they arrived, which was a tradition for a trained Druid to be given a hide of land? Question, open question to you. There's a big response here, as you can imagine, from the Pope. So they commissioned Baronius to look at the same story. And he went through the same story, and he confirmed that everything that Polydoro had said was true. And the doomsday secret was, in fact, that it was Jesus' son and not Jesus himself at that particular point, at that particular time. that's the family tree of the genealogy, and the genealogy is clearly stated in the chronology of the Acts of the Apostles, which is a separate document of the Acts of the Apostles, and for obvious reasons it was removed from the record because it shows the family tree and Jesus' three children: Tamar, Jesus too, the Justus, and Josephus. And it was Jesus too, the crown prince, with his uncle, who was Jesus' brother, Joseph of Arimathea, who dedicated that chapel to Mary Magdalene at that time. And then we have the first edict against the heirs of Jesus was instituted by Vespasian in AD 70. They went as hard as they could to wipe out all the relatives of Jesus. Old King Cole and good King Caractacus is just passing by as well. Bring a bit of lightness into the story. And of course it was old King Cole's grandson, who was Constantine, who eventually became emperor and proclaimed Christianity as the state religion of Rome. And then Rome took it and made it their own and broke all the rules. Destruction of all the records. The demise of the Nazarene-based Celtic Church. And this is the conclusion which I've already gone through. The first beginnings of Christian piety existed in Britain, and its birthplace from AD 35 was Glastonbury. Chief Rabbi Sachs, just a brief comments there, and you can see just how serious things are at the moment. This is what the Catholic Church said on Wednesday, July the 11th. If it isn't Roman Catholic, it's not a proper church. Pope tells Christians. Protestants accuse Rome of lust for power. Unbelievable. We're still fighting. Henry George, here is the conclusion to the whole matter I talked about reciprocity in Confucius. That we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us. That we should respect the rights of others as scrupulously as we would have our own rights respected, is not a mere counsel of perfection to individuals, but is the law to which we must conform social institutions and national policy if we would secure the blessings of abundance and peace. Nobody's ever put the modern world in a better context than that, and that was for the First World War. Giordano Bruno, he had reached the conclusion that I believe I've reached, and I hope many other people have reached, that we find God all around us, and it's here in ourselves, in nature. It's the Great Spirit of all our so-called primitive indigenous peoples who understand the Great Spirit. And this is this wonderful quote: "We seek God in the unchangeable, unalterable laws of nature, in the reverential disposition of the mind directed towards those laws. We seek him with the light of the sun, in the banks of all that springs from the bosom of Mother Earth, in the true reflection of his being, in the sight of unnumbered stars, which shine on the immeasurable skirts of the one heaven, and live and feel and think and magnify the all-good, the all-one, the highest.